Good morning, everyone. Oh man, I hate the early show. Look, everybody stayed in bed this morning because they're just exhausted from the last 3 days. Uh, this is going to be a warm-up show for the chef. Well, maybe not. Basically, what we're going to do, we're going to have a little fun today. We're going to talk about the destination that I love probably more than any other, called ships. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today is some ship stuff to make it more genteel. Anyway, we think it'll be a lot of fun and hopefully it'll be informational. I think you'll come away with understanding some things that you didn't understand, hopefully, before. Anyway, ahoy in sailor speak is the way in olden days sailors would get in, contact with each other across the open water. So let's get going here. Ahoy! All right, that works. Now I use this as a little introduction about myself because it was on that ship, not Columbus's little boat to the left, the bigger ship, that I first fell in love with the sea. Back in the dark ages, I went to the Coast Guard Academy, and we sailed 4 times on the Eagle to places like Europe, the Caribbean, Canada, all over the Atlantic, stuff like that. Primarily, that's used to train, still used today, to train young men and women for careers in the Coast Guard. And on that ship, they learn navigation, seamanship, teamwork, leadership, all the things that you really need to be able to handle as an officer in the Coast Guard. Meteorology, you got to know about wind and weather because your primary mode of motion was from the winds. Anyway, she's home ported in New London, Connecticut. She moors at the Coast Guard Academy when she's not away on cruises or in a shipyard getting repair work done. So if you ever go to New London, I strongly encourage you, go visit her. She's beautiful. I think she's beautiful. Not quite as luxurious as this ship or any other cruise ship, but still pretty darn nice. Now, before we begin, I got to give you a few terms so that you can kind of understand. SV stands for sailing vessel, and SS stands for steamship, although today's steamship is kind of a little bit not used so much anymore, so most people use MV or MS, motor vessel or motor ship. There are still a few steamships around, but not too many. RMS is a Royal Mail ship. Those are ships that were carrying mail for the British government. HMS is Her Majesty's ship. Sometime in maybe 20 or 30 years, it might be His Majesty's ship. She's hanging on, so you never know. Anyway, also there's USS, which is the United States ships. Those are U.S. Navy ships. But my favorite, which isn't up here, is USCGC, which stands for United States Coast Guard Cutter. Those are the ships of the Coast Guard. So now we got to look at kind of what makes up a ship. Now, a ship, basically, the hull of a ship is just a big watertight box, and it floats. Well, we hope it floats anyway. The superstructure sits up on top of that box, generally above the main deck, and up in the superstructure, for the most part, that's where you have the cabins and the lounges and the dining rooms and all that kind of stuff. At the bottom of the hull is the keel. Keel is a big, long steel beam that runs the full length of the ship. It's a major structural element of the ship. It gives it most of its strength. Now, the ships are divided into compartments, and those are just boxes that are within that hull. And those compartments are there to give it some added safety. They're divided by floors that we call decks. So you have deck 1, deck 2, deck 3, deck 4, and also by bulkheads, which are nothing more than watertight walls between the decks. And if you go down below where we live on this ship, and you get down into where they have watertight compartments, you'll see special doors that separate all of that stuff. Now, all that compartmentalization adds a lot of added safety to the ship. Basically, the compartments are there so that if you've got a hole in one compartment, and outside of a ship, we don't intend to do that. That generally tends to ruin the captain's whole day. Basically, because of the compartmentalization, the water won't spread beyond that particular place. Now, all ships, I don't care what kind of ship it is, essentially are built the same way. They have some differences based on what their uses are for. So tankers and container ships and cruise ships and other cargo ships all are built essentially the same way. It's only the application that makes them be a little different. Now, the extension of the keel that comes up in the front of the ship, or the bow of the ship to the main deck, is sometimes called the stem, kind of like the stem of an apple. But that pointy thing that sticks up is the stem. The bow or the forward is the forward end of the ship, the front. It's usually more pointed than the stern or the aft end. And on cruise ships, it's here in the bow that you have the lounges, the bridge, things like the spa, those kind of things. That's normally up in the bow. Now back on the other end, this is the aft or the stern of the ship. It's generally more flat or rounded than the bow. And the aft end of the ship is usually where you can find food services and all that sort of stuff. Now you know two very, very important nautical terms: the pointy end and the blunt end. So if you ever get lost, you just ask people where the blunt end is. Anyway, the starboard or right-hand side that you can see here is determined when you're facing forward. So if you're standing anywhere on a ship and you're looking toward the pointy end, the right-hand side is starboard. Now, it's not really clear where the real term starboard came from, but there is some, at least anecdotal evidence, that it came because back in the olden days when ships used to be steered by a special oar, since most of the sailors in that time, as is true today, were right-handed, they hung the steering oar off the starboard side of the ship, the right-hand side of the ship, so the guy could steer. So it was the steerboard side. Either in Old English or Viking, they're not sure exactly where it started from, but that was the side that the ship was steered from, starboard. Now the other side of the ship is port, and that's the nautical term that refers to the left side of the ship. Kind of one easy way to remember that is left and port both have 4 letters, but we'll go more into that. There's one there. That's port. That's the port on this ship, but that's my port. Anyway, it used to be called the larboard side. And it was called the larboard side because that was the side of the ship on which the ship was larded or loaded. And they always put that side of the ship up against the pier because they didn't want to break their steering oars. So it became very common. It was the larboard side. It was the larboard side for centuries. And then back in the late 1700s, the early 1800s, captains started to realize when they had these big sailing ships that larboard and starboard, when you were giving commands from the bridge, a lot of times would get confused, particularly if there's wind and noise and cannon fire and all that kind of stuff. Go to starboard, not larboard. Anyway, they decided that they had to have a different term. So they said, wait a minute, we put that side against the port, so let's call it the port side. It kind of caught on, and then in the mid-1800s, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, finally said, we're going to make it official. That's the port side. Now, actually, that's not the whole story. As my wife will tell you, that's really the side where they keep the really good wine. All right, 3 men were out in a small boat, and they were sailing along, and they got shipwrecked on this deserted island. And they were there for a couple of days, and one day while walking along the beach, they looked down and they saw a bottle laying there, and they thought, oh, we could put a note in a bottle and throw it back into the ocean, and somebody will find the note and they'll come and rescue us. So they rubbed the sand off the bottle, and poof, out came a genie. And the genie said, I am the genie of the bottle. Because you have released me, I can give you 3 wishes. And to be fair, since there's 3 of you, I'll give each of you 1 wish, and 1 wish only. So the first guy says, gee, I really miss my wife, my kids. I want to be home. I wish I was home right now. Poof, he's gone. So then the second guy looks at the genie, thinks about it for a minute, says, yeah, I don't have a wife and family, but boy, I just kind of would love to be out on Waikiki Beach having a nice pina colada and enjoying the sun and the people. I wish I was on Waikiki Beach. Poof, he's gone. Well, the third guy, he's kind of a little bit milquetoasty. He's looking around, and he's kind of pulling his feet and looking around, and the genie's looking at him, and he's looking around, and the genie said, come on, come on, come on. I don't have all day here. Make up your mind. Guy looks around a little more, and he goes, You know, it sure is lonely here. I wish those guys were back. Oh, here we go. We could try to get that for you, but I don't think you'd like it that much. Anyway, the ocean is a pretty dynamic and ever-changing environment. And ships' movements have specific titles or names, and they're called pitch, roll, and yaw. And basically, airplanes and spaceship can also experience these sort of things. And all of these on ships are driven by the winds and the waves. Well, sometimes because somebody gets crazy steering them, but mostly it's by wind and waves. Anyway, pitch is the movement of the ship, the bow of the ship up and down. And sometimes it can be pretty dramatic. And that's caused when the big waves are coming from right straight ahead of the ship. And then you have a thing that's called yaw, and that's where the bow of the ship swings back and forth from one side to the other. That's kind of my favorite. Anyway, that's caused when the waves are coming from about 45 degrees off of either bow. So it causes the ship to kind of push off to the side, and then the rudder will bring it back over to where it's supposed to be. And then there's everybody's favorite, roll. Roll is where there's a big long line that runs the full length of the ship, and it just kind of rolls like this. Oh, that's the one that usually gets most people because it's a relatively short, sharp motion. And so anyway, there are some things that are design features within a ship that actually tend to, well, I won't say get rid of it, but at least moderate it so that it makes it more comfortable. As we sail along, it's pretty hard to remember that we're on a ship in the open ocean because it is pretty stable. One of the things that helps that stability is the bulbous bow. Now, this one's not the real big bulb like we have. If you go out on a pier when we're in port and you go down under, just walk along the pier, don't climb down onto the water. If you look under the bow, you'll see this big bulby thing sticking out under the front. That's the bulbous bow, and it reduces the pitch of the vessel as it passes through the water. It also makes the hull of the ship a lot more efficient because it allows the ship to pass more easily through the water. Now, in this illustration, if you didn't have the bulbous bow, what would happen is the water would push up against the bow, and you'd have a big bow wave like this. That would also cause a much bigger wake, and because it's got to push that big bow wave up, it takes an awful lot of energy from the ship. Now, if you took just the bulbous bow and you didn't have the ship there, and you looked at the way the bulbous bow goes through the water, it's kind of like a submarine or a porpoise or a whale just under the surface, and it would have these little bumps on the top. Not a real big wave because it's just under the surface of the water. If you combine the two, what happens is you get a smaller bow wave, much smaller bow wave than you would without the bulbous bow. That makes it a lot more efficient. It makes the ship go a little faster for the same amount of power. And as I said, it also gets rid of pitch. Now, until the seas get really, really big, and I don't think we're going to see anything like that, at least not until day after tomorrow. No. Until it gets really big, rolling used to make people queasy. Generally isn't even felt. Like right now, you don't feel any roll at all. Now, there's not much of a sea out there right now, but we're not getting much of a roll. And one of the reasons is a thing called the stabilizers. The stabilizers are like big wings, and they swing out from the side of the ship, and they do a couple of things. They have sensors that adjust their pitch to make the ship feel a little stiffer. They also make the ocean think the ship is a little wider, so it reduces the roll. One of the nice things about this is they can fold back into these slots on the side of the ship. And that's a big deal because if the captain forgets to bring those in when he pulls into a harbor, he's going to cut down some piers and make the harbor master somewhat unhappy with him. Of course, the ship's owners aren't going to be real happy because then they have to replace the stabilizers. If you ever get a chance to dive down under a ship, or you just happen to walk into a dry dock when a ship is in dry dock, underneath older ships and a lot of even newer ships, this is what you might see in the aft end. It's the rudder and the propeller. Now, the propeller acts like your household fan. Basically, it turns, it pushes water just like the fan pushes air. That pressure of the water pushes the ship forward. And the rudder is just a big flat thing that's kind of like a barn door on a hinge, and it moves from one side to the other. It's controlled by mechanisms that are connected to the bridge, And as that moves from one side to the other, it changes the direction that the water flows when it comes out of the propeller, and it causes the ship to turn. Now, an azimuth pod is the new generation of things. This all started when they were doing oceanographic research and mineral research out in the deep waters. These are big electric motors that hang down underneath the ship. They have the ability to turn 360 degrees. They're just big motors. They don't need a rudder because the motor itself can turn. They're in these watertight compartments. They give a ship a lot of maneuverability. Ships can move sideways, backwards. They can go in circles. They can hold their positions very accurately. And these things are strong enough that they're even used on modern icebreakers. Mostly, though, they're used on oceanographic and natural resource research vessels. Now, this is one of the things that our captain uses. This is why he doesn't need to, well, I shouldn't say he doesn't need to use a tugboat. He doesn't use tugboats in an awful lot of the ports that we go into. Some ports require them to still use them even though they don't need them. And that's because they have these thrusters. Now, the thrusters are just a tunnel that goes through the hull of the ship from one side to the other, has a big electric motor with a propeller on it. The motor can turn in either direction, and it can literally move the ship sideways. Also helps them to be able to turn a lot more rapidly when they're in a harbor environment. And these things are really pretty efficient. When we get underway, usually it's easier to see it when we're getting underway than it is when we're going into a port, because when we're going into a port, it's pushing the water from the pier side out, and it's not quite as evident. But when we're first getting underway from a pier, if you look down between the ship and a pier, you'll see the water coming out of the thrusters. It's a little more evident. Basically, though, the thrusters have done a lot to get rid of the tugboat industry. Now, a ship's draft is the vertical measurement from the bottom of the keel up to where the water is. Okay? The draft is the minimum depth of the water that the ship needs to float. And it also can be used to determine the displacement for the cargo and everything else. And they use Archimedes' principle. He was a Greek classmate of mine at the Coast Guard Academy who figured out that bodies float because they displace the amount of water equal to their or greater than their weight. So when you take something and you put it in the water, the amount of water that it displaces is how much it weighs. Basically, the maximum draft of the ship that's in this picture is about 21, just a little bit over 21 meters. That's a deep draft ship. About 67 feet if you want to put it into that category. Now, our draft on this ship is 6 meters or so, about 20 feet. There's a big difference between us and them. Needless to say, we can get into piers and ports that are a lot different than this big guy can get into, and we can go through canals that he'd have a real trouble getting through. Now, the density of the water has to be taken into account when you're going into places like the Panama Canal, because fresh water is less dense than salt water. So as you go into the Panama Canal, what will happen, a ship will actually drop lower because it's going into that fresh water. So the Canal Authority has these charts that say, okay, this ship has this kind of a draft for this kind of water, and we need to be able to determine whether it can fit into the canal. Now also there is in addition to this draft, every ship carries a chart that says how much draft is required in all different kinds of water: salt water, warm water, cold water, fresh water, and so on. Now, ships and boats all use lights at night, or at least they're supposed to. And this is kind of just the standard set of lights. There are some special lights that show when you're broken down or fishing and under pilotage and all that sort of stuff. But basically, you have a red light and a green light. The red light's on the left side, the green light's on the right side, and that determines who has the right of way in any meeting situation at night. And then you have white lights that kind of tell somebody that sees you what direction you're going. You have a stern light, you have a masthead light, and then you have these other lights that kind of give you an indication of what's going on. Now, those are pretty standard lights, and sometimes, you look at them and you go, well, that's pretty straightforward, but they could have some unexpected results. Back in 2010, actually, we were on another cruise ship not too far from where this happened, about 1:30 or so in the morning on a moonless night, some young entrepreneurs from Somali, known as pirates, were sitting out in the Indian Ocean, and they saw a ship with these lights. And they thought, oh, and it was just steaming slowly to the south in the Indian Ocean. And they thought, oh, wow, this is really nice. Look at that ship. We could capture that ship. It's a nice calm night. They won't see us coming because it's dark. So they fired a rocket-propelled grenade at that ship. Oops. Basically, they pretty soon discovered that it was the USS Nicholas, and that's a Navy frigate that was on patrol primarily on the pirate deterrence activity in the Indian Ocean. The Nicholas's defensive systems picked up the rocket-propelled grenade long before it got to the ship. Of course, in missile time, that's not very long. And it fired a missile back to where the rocket-propelled grenade came from, and poof! They didn't go to Waikiki Beach, but there was a big hole in the water where the pirates had been. Nearby, there was another boat that had some more of these enterprising young Somalis in it, and the Nicholas picked it up on their radar. That boat turned and ran back to their mothership, which was another bigger boat, and the Nicholas followed them, and they captured pirates, several of them, and the others back in the hole in the water had just disappeared into the night. Basically, the ones that they did capture were taken to Norfolk, Virginia, where they were tried for piracy. That's a whole nother story. You have to meet me in Baristas if you want to get the outcome of that one. Anyway, the captain on this ship, and on every cruise ship, oh, that's not our captain, by the way, has the best office of anybody in the world. I really believe this. When I had my own ships, I always thought, I loved it on the bridge. It has a great view. It goes all the way around. You can see 360 degrees from the bridge. You might have to go out on a bridge wing to look aft, but you can at least see all the way around. But it's from the bridge that the captain and his deck officers navigate and control the operation of the ship. Now, this bridge, as I said, gives you a nearly full view all the way around, and it contains some of the most modern electronic equipment that you're going to be able to find anywhere in the world. Now, this is a flash from the past. This is the bridge from the RMS Queen Mary. She's now a museum ship, as you know, in Long Beach, California. Now, everything that was on this bridge on the Queen Mary is still on ship's bridges today. There's a gyro compass, and that's used to determine the direction that the ship is heading. There's an engine order telegraph, which in this case on the Queen Mary was a mechanical linkage between the bridge and the engine room to tell the engineers how fast the captain wanted to go and whether he wanted to go ahead or astern. And then there's a compass binnacle, which was a kind of a big brass box or a container where the magnetic compass was held. And then last but not least, there's the helm. That's just basically the steering wheel. I have one of these in my car. Google hasn't taken it away from me yet. Now, today's bridge looks more like a video arcade than it does like one of the bridges of the past. Steering may be done simply with a joystick, and that joystick is electronically connected through a whole bunch of servos and motors to the rudder, or even to the azimuth pods. When the ship is in open water and there's no other vessels in the vicinity, a lot of times there'll only be two people on the bridge, and they're not even touching the controls. The computers are doing everything. They're steering the ship, they're watching the radar, and all the people that are there for as if something goes wrong. In other words, it works kind of like an airplane or our cars on autopilot. You all have autopilot, right? I do, because she sits right next to me. Anyway, ship's computers get their input from all kinds of things. They get through satellites. They have gyro compasses, radar, global positioning systems, and depth finders that kind of give them all sorts of information. The term radar is an acronym for the Radio Detection and Ranging System, uses radio waves to identify range, direction, and speed of objects such as ships, weather formations, and land. I bet you didn't know land could move, did you? Well, it does in relationship to us. Anyway, these things can track numerous contacts at the same time. They sound alarms when unsafe conditions arise, and they can even recommend course changes for changes in course and speed. And of course, even that can be superseded by the captain if he decides not to use the electronic systems. Today, the use of GPS is pretty much invaluable. Everybody has them. You have them in your watch, you have them in your iPad, your iPhone, your car. Everybody has them. The Global Positioning System, or GPS, is a navigation satellite system. It was originally developed by the U.S. Department of Defense, and now some other governments and other agencies have started to put up their own systems. It's accurate to within a few feet. The really high precision ones are accurate to within less than a foot. It's very precise. It can also give you some very good safe navigational information. The GPS system uses 32 separate satellites that are just kind of circling around the Earth, and they give a ship, through its computer system and its receivers, the ability to calculate its location, the accurate time, the velocity, ship speed, and all that. Now, the ships use a much bigger one than you probably have in your car or your watch, but basically it works exactly the same way. And when the ship goes through a tunnel, they lose the GPS just like you do on your computer, on your car. Developed by the Chinese, actually, about almost 2,000 years ago, and then spread to the West about 1,000 years ago. These magnetic compasses have been used for thousands of years. Today, it's been replaced by a more sophisticated means of determining the heading of a ship. These old magnetic compasses are still found on every ship that floats. In fact, on this ship, it sits up above the bridge on deck 11. The reason it works when there's no electricity, when you have an electronic or electrical failure on the bridge, at least you have the ability to still tell your heading, so that if you've got some kind of ability to propel the ship without being able to navigate, you can still tell which way you're going. But they're very susceptible to metal influences, so people, sailors that are comfortable around ships and stuff, don't go near the magnetic compass carrying a keys or a knife or something other made of steel, because it'll cause the compass to be in error. Now, the gyro compass, which we have on this ship, just like others, basically works similar to a kid's top, where you get a top spinning, it'll stay upright. Well, the gyro compass is a very heavy weight that spins very, very rapidly, and basically it gets to set to north, and this fast spinning wheel will stay aligned to north no matter where you are in the globe. They're widely used on ships today, and they have two main advantages over the old magnetic compass. They find true north, where the magnetic compass always pointed to some artificial magnetic place in northern Canada called the magnetic North Pole. And also, these things will work basically without interference from the metal of the ship. Now, this is a transcript of a radio conversation between a Navy ship and a Coast Guard station. The Coast Guard starts out by saying, "Approaching vessel, please divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a possible disaster." The Navy replied, "Negative, negative. We recommend you turn 15 degrees to the north." Coast Guard, "Negative, negative. You must turn 15 degrees to the south." From the Navy, the Navy captain, "This is the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan. It's one of the largest carriers in the United States Navy. We are being escorted by cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and other support vessels. I demand you change your course or expect unbearable consequences. We must defend these ships." Coast Guard, "Your call, Captain. This is Seaman Apprentice Brian here on this here lighthouse." My twin brother was in the Navy. He hates that joke. His ship ran aground. Sextants are another thing that came out of the past, and there's still a lot of captains still require their officers to be familiar with them. I personally think they're a great idea. Sextants are used to measure the angle of satellites and the sun and stars and so on between the horizon and the celestial body. They can also be used to measure angles between things on shore. You don't need to have electricity to use them. All you need is a good stopwatch, and you can tell what time it is. And by getting a good time and a good angle, you can actually draw a line on a chart. You get 5 or 6 different angles that are all really accurate, and you get a little pinpoint that looks like an asterisk, and there you are. All that angle is called shooting a star or taking an alignment. Anyway, today they don't do it by manual calculations. back in the dark ages when Archimedes and I were at the academy, we had to write all this stuff out in pencil and paper. Today they have a little calculator, you know, you do a little pocket calculator, stick it in there and you get the position automatically. So it's a little bit useful. But what happens if your calculator battery goes dead? Then you better be able to do it with a pencil. Ships can't go anywhere without an engine room. Now, I personally think that the most important people on any ship, bar none, other than maybe the captain, are the engineers. Because without the engineers, there's no power. There's no way to get propulsion. Now, this is the engine room. Actually, it's the boiler room from the Titanic. I took that just before we sailed from Southampton. No, it's actually from the Titanic exhibit in Belfast. But anyway, that's what it looked like. And this was a very, very hot, dirty, smelly place, very noisy. There were men in this room who stoked these boilers with shovels full of coal. And that was their job. And this place was almost unbearable. It was dry, it was dirty, humid, and very, very noisy. Now, modern engine rooms are a little bit different. They're clean, they're highly automated, they're pretty well lighted, they're air conditioned. Yeah, well, they are still pretty noisy, but they're the heart and soul of a ship. Without these things, we're not going to go anywhere. Now, some engines today still require steam. That's getting rare, more and more rare, but even in that case, the steam is no longer made with coal. It's now made with oil or gas. Most ships today use diesel or diesel-electric propulsion systems. The diesel-electric configuration, you have these large diesel generators like these, and they turn a generator. The diesels turn a generator. The generator makes the electrical power that then goes out for use across the ship. And they use that for things like lighting and air conditioning and electronics and all that sort of stuff. But the largest single user of that electricity are the propellers and the power that runs the ship. Now, not too far away from that is the engineering control room, and that's linked to the bridge. Today, the control rooms are basically automated, and they're connected electronically to the bridge. They're very responsive, very quick, and in a lot of cases, you don't even need to have someone in the control room to be able to change the direction or the speed of the ship, simply because it's all connected electronically. They are manned and staffed all the time because you never know, something might happen. The people that work in these rooms, though, maintain all the systems that we need to keep this ship operating. Stuff like propulsion and water supply and sanitation. And without this engineering control room, our health and comfort would be a lot more at risk, as would be our safety. Every few days on a cruise, you may hear an announcement when we're in port. You're not going to hear it too much when we're at sea, that the outer decks are closed and smoking is not allowed. And that's because we're bunkering. Now, what's bunkering? Bunkering is we pulled into a gas station and we're going to get a load of fuel. Now, why do we need fuel so often? Well, there's two reasons. One is basically by keeping the ship's fuel tanks full, the ship rides a little bit lower in the water, and because it's a little bit heavier, it actually rides a little more comfortably. It doesn't roll quite as much. It doesn't pitch quite as much because it's heavier. And second is more fuel means more range. Because if you miss a port because of weather or whatever, you got to have enough fuel to get to the next port. It's kind of like driving out across Death Valley and your car has enough gas to go 100 miles and the gas stations are 75 miles apart. If you get to the first gas station and it's closed, you could be in big trouble. If you get to the first gas station and you don't buy gas, you will be in big trouble because you won't have enough to get to the next one. Anyway, to give you an idea, this ship uses 22,000 gallons of fuel a day. That's just a tad bit more than my Prius, just a little bit. Now, the ship in the background, anybody know what that is? Well, not quite. It's Sydney. It's our sister Nautica, and that was in Liverpool. She was bunkering against the Mersey Spirit. Okay, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Everybody know where that came from? Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, right? Okay, drinking water, where does it come from? Well, on our ship, when we're in port, sometimes you'll see this blue hose that goes out on the pier and hooks up into a little valve out there. and they're getting water from shore. Potable water comes aboard the ship. They keep the tanks full. Basically, those tanks are large enough to pretty much supply the needs of everyone on board for several days. It's not like we're going to run out of water right away. But in the event that we cannot obtain potable water that's clean and safe to drink and all that from shore facilities, the ship does have some desalination equipment on board. And in that case, those desalination systems can make water that's so pure you won't like the taste of it. It'll be chemically pure water, nothing in it but water. And people don't like the taste of that. So they actually can adjust the system to allow just a little touch of impurities, a little bit of salt, a little bit of minerals to go back into that water so that it tastes like normal water. To give you an idea of how much water we consume, this ship consumes 63,000 gallons of fresh water every day. The desalination plant on the ship can make about 125,000 gallons when it's running, so that's not a real problem for us, and that's about 500 tons of water every day. Communication outside the ship, this is what it used to look like. It's really important. All the ships need to be able to talk to each other as well as to shore facilities and everything else. And gone are the days of these radio rooms where you had wires and sparky things that went snip and snap and the guy with a little key going did-it. They don't do that anymore. Now everything that's needed to communicate basically is in a console that's up on the bridge. The technology today allows the ship a much greater and clearer range of data and voice transmissions than was possible maybe just 10 years ago. And satellites have added a whole new dimension with computers. Communication now is almost instantaneous. Fortunately, the guys on the bridge have a little better internet connection sometimes than we do, but nonetheless, it's still pretty accurate. And the thing that's interesting about this, most ships today also have a system so that the home office can track where the ship is and what's happening on the ship, so that if something goes wrong, they know where the ship is. They know what's going on. I do a talk later on, and it's actually going to be in the next cruise, about the Bermuda Triangle and the freighter, the Alfaro. And I talk a little bit about how they figured out where the Alfaro was and what happened to it. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. Now, when ships come into port, and we're going to do this one more time, when there's no adequate shore pier facilities for the ship, you get transported in by tenders. Everybody here has been on the tenders, right? Now, basically, that's just a secondary role for these sturdy little boats. They really are lifeboats. And what happens is, you can kind of remember, we did that thing at the beginning of the cruise with those lovely orange designer life jackets. Now, when you're on these tenders, and there's about 80 people on there, and you're all grousing about how crowded it is, remember that in the case of an emergency, there's going to be 150 people on that boat, all wearing those designer life jackets. Are going to be a lot more cozy. Anyway, the thing that's interesting about these boats is they will stay afloat whether they are overloaded, full of water, or whatever. They will not sink. They will not roll over. On board these boats, they have life-saving equipment. They have radios. They have first aid equipment, food, water, all that kind of stuff. When you first get on the board, they even give you a seasick pill, so you don't have to worry about seasickness. Their primary role is not to take us back to Rome or into a port. Their primary role is to get us out away from the ship in case of an actual emergency, and to get all of the life rafts and boats together to make a great big island so that people from airplanes can see it. Anyway, the next time you go on one of these to tender, which will be when we get to Crete, take a look around. I think you're going to find that it's really, really an interesting boat. It's got all kinds of stuff that most people never even think about when they're on the tenders. Now we're going to take a little walk around this ship. On shore, this is called a hallway. On a ship, it's called a passageway. And on this ship, you got some of them that are real long. They run almost the full length of the ship. If we were in some really heavy seas and the ship was working, pitching and rolling and twisting, you could stand at one end of this hallway and look down that hallway and actually see that motion of the ship. It's one of my favorite things to do in heavy seas. My wife thinks I'm a little off kilter. Now, on military vessels, there's a pattern to ease the flow of traffic during emergencies. Basically, you go up the stairs, those are called ladders, and forward on the starboard side, and you go down the stairs and go aft on the port side. So everybody's kind of going in this counterclockwise direction, and that makes it a lot more efficient. Now, on here, all of our stairways are kind of in the middle, so it doesn't work so much. And also, we have very different roles when it comes to emergencies, so we don't have to go through all of that. Now, on a cruise ship, guests call their rooms cabins, staterooms, suites, penthouses, whatever. Traditionally, on a military vessel, the captain has a cabin. The ship's officers have staterooms. The senior enlisted personnel have quarters. And the junior enlisted personnel, the junior personnel on a ship, are in what's called berthing areas, kind of big common bunk rooms almost. But even the plushest living accommodations on a military ship just can't compare with anything that's on a cruise ship. Anyway, two weary diplomats, they were taking the overnight ferry from Helsinki to, I guess they were going to Sweden. And they got to the port and they found out that there was only one cabin left. This was a man and a woman. They had never met before. They just met when they got to the purser's office. And they both said they had to be in Sweden the next day. They couldn't wait to take the next day's ferry. And the purser said, I'm sorry, we only have one room, and if you don't want it, then I'll give it to somebody else, and you'll have to wait till tomorrow. Well, they looked at each other, and they finally said, well, we can get over that man-woman stuff, and so we'll take the room. They go to the room, and the man, being a gentleman, he said he'd take the upper bunk. And the lady said, thank you very much, and she took the lower bunk, and they turned in for the night, and figuring they'd get up in the morning, and they'd go off and do their own thing. About 1 o'clock in the morning, the man kind of woke up, and he's a little cranky, and he looks out over the side, and the woman's laying down there, and he goes, Madam. And she looks up, and she goes, what do you want? He said, it's kind of cold. Could you throw me a blanket? And she thought about it for a minute, and she kind of looked up at him, and she said, I'll tell you what. We've never met before. I don't know you from a crow. You don't know me. We're never going to see each other again. But just for tonight, just this one time, why don't we pretend we're husband and wife? Huh. So the guy thinks, oh, wow, I can't believe my good fortune. He said, that's a great idea. She looks up and she says, get your own blanket. Food on military ships, I have to tell you, I know this for a fact. Food on our Navy ships and our Coast Guard ships is really, really very good. Anybody who says that the food that you get in a mess is either on shore stations for the Air Force and the Army or Marine Corps, or what you get on ship is second rate, I got to tell you they're wrong. It's really, really good. The food service that they have on ships is good, but not as good as you get on a cruise ship. This ship has probably the best food in the ocean. And in ship speak, all of that gets put together in a place called the galley. Now, the galley is a beehive of activity. It runs around the clock. They're either cleaning up from the last meal or fixing for the next meal or doing all kinds of specialty things for the buffet, for the specialty restaurants, for the grand dining room, the terrace, whatever. This place is always busy. And the chefs and their staffs actually work to provide the guests with the absolute best food that they can come up with. Now, to give you an idea, meals on a cruise ship, it's pretty amazing when you think about how far away we are from being able to just run down to the local store to buy something and the number of meals that they have to prepare on any given day. Now, within any vessel, adequate provisioning is always critical. Actually, it's true no matter whether you're in military or in civilian life. Logistics and supply is really the very, very important thing. And that's really critical even on a cruise ship. To give you an idea, the passengers and crew on a modern cruise ship, maybe a little bit bigger than this, about this size maybe, they'll go through about 20,000 pounds of beef, some 28,000 eggs, 8,000 gallons of ice cream, and 18,000 slices of pizza. That's in a week. Sometimes I think that's in a day, but no, that's in a week. And of course, there's always plenty of entertainment, all right? Cruise ships are resorts in and of themselves. They basically have shows. Actually, you've seen some of the new shows, the production shows that they're starting to develop here. And I think people are going to find over the long run that that's really enjoyable. The theaters and lounges all offer top performers in the evening, and during the day, we've heard people actually complain there's so much to do they can't do it all. There's bridge lessons and cooking and crafts and computer training, you name it, ships have it. There's something for everybody. Now, my own personal thing is that the absolute best bang for the buck are the enrichment lecturers and their lame jokes. Anyway, speaking of lame jokes, down in the Caribbean, there was a cruise that went out every week. This was one of the less upper class cruise lines. Anyway, they went out every week. They'd go out for a week, and then they'd come in to get a whole new set of passengers. And on the ship, they had a magician. And that magician had an act that he did. And he did it every night on the cruise. And then over time, there was a parrot standing in the back of the lounge on a little platform. And the parrot got to know what the routine was. And after a while, the guy would do his act, and the parrot would say, "Ark, it's a different hat. Ark, all the cards are the ace of spades. Ark, the flowers were under the table." Well, the magician was beside himself, but he couldn't do anything because it turns out the parrot was the captain's favorite pet. Well, as luck would have it, that ship sank. All of the people got into lifeboats and rafts, and they all went ashore, and they were all safe, and except for the magician and the parrot. They ended up on some floating debris out in the middle of the Caribbean. And the magician looked at the parrot, and the parrot looked at the magician. This went on for several days. Finally, the magician started to think, "I'm looking at lunch." And the parrot finally looks at the magician and goes, "Okay, wise guy, what'd you do with a ship?" Anyway, watch your currents for the next one of these talks. I think it's day after tomorrow, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today. I'll go out to baristas if you want to come out and chat, and then a little bit later this morning, the chef is going to come in here and cook up some delicious stuff. Thank you very much. Have a great day.